Hi everyone, this is your instructor Tom. This is a quick video to show you some of the resources that can help you when you start to revise your paper. I intend it for after you've submitted your draft. That being said, of course, if you want to use some of these things when you're writing your draft, that's okay too. But what I'm intending is once you have your draft, you can start looking at these things and that will help you revise what you're trying to do. So the first thing I want to call your attention to is some stuff on Blackboard that's designed to help you. So if you're on the Blackboard page and you go to the lessons section, remember I put a bunch of things in week 2 that's designed to help you revise this paper. So go to the folder that's entitled Paper 1 Stuff. Once you click that link, you'll see a number of different things that I've posted here. I'd like you to look at all of these before you turn in your final draft. One of the things is a student sample essay. This will give you a good idea of what the final paper can look like. A word of warning, it's not a perfect paper, but I would say it's a pretty good paper. And once you have a sense of what the paper's trying to do, I think this will give you a good idea of how you put everything together. There's a good introduction strategy. The body of the paper tells a couple of nice narratives that support the thesis, and so on. I'll go over that a little more later. Right now I want to look, though, at some of the other stuff. There is a paper on common conclusion mistakes. I'm going to put that off to a little bit later, too. And there is a works cited example. This is a document that will tell you what your works cited page should look like. I'll talk a little bit more about MLA citation next week, but for right now, this is a nice template, the works cited example, to show you what that page should look like. The document I really want to look at, though, today is part of the Paper 1 opening thesis document here. And basically what this is a checklist that provides you a series of lists of things that you need to think about as you're revising your paper. In other words, it goes through the introduction. It talks more specifically about your thesis here. It talks about the body of the paper. There is even some limited discussion about the conclusion on this handout. So after you've turned in your draft, I really want you to look very carefully at this document and go through some of the advice that I have for you here. The main thing I want to focus on today in this document is thesis statements, right? And I also want to incorporate some of the things that hopefully came up when you were doing the week thesis revision activity. So let's think about thesis statements for a second. So hopefully when you went over the week thesis activity, you did learn a few things about what a thesis should and shouldn't do. I think you guys did a good job on highlighting the problems with thesis. What I want to do here is just boil down what I think are the main things that you should take away from that activity when you start thinking about your own thesis. All right, the first of them is that your thesis needs to make a claim or an argument. It needs to be what you would call an arguable position. Those first two thesis problems, doesn't make a claim or makes a weak claim, are really indications of papers that aren't trying to make an argument. So when you're thinking about the narrative you're writing for this assignment, you really want this narrative to illustrate a claim or a lesson or a kind of moral, if you will. It's not a great word, but the idea is that your narrative or story is supposed to prove something to the reader, prove a lesson that the reader is supposed to learn from this experience. So you need to think that your thesis is an argument, right? And a good rule of thumb is, could a reasonable person disagree with what I'm trying to say? And could we have a substantive argument on what we're talking about? And you want the answer to that question to be yes. If it's so obviously true that that's not the case, then you don't really need to write a paper to prove it, right? What you're trying to do is to persuade me of a certain point or an idea. And if the paper is so obvious that it doesn't need persuasion at all, then it's not going to be interesting. That's the first thing. The next thing is that you need to be specific. One thing I think when you guys were improving the thesis statements that you worked on for the week thesis activities, most of you got a lot better at being more specific from the bad thesis to the good thesis you were trying to write. So that's a very good thing. Sometimes students think that a vague thesis statement is a good way to go because it lets you write about more different things, but that's a trap and it's a good way to get yourself stuck when you're writing. In other words, related to the above idea that you're trying to make an argument or a claim, the more specific that claim is, the better off you are because you know what you're trying to prove. And you're going to know what it is that you need to do to try and prove it. When you have a vague or a weak claim or a very broad claim, then your paper can go everywhere. And you get in the problem where you get to every new paragraph and you're sort of reinventing the wheel. I don't know what to write. Well, that's because you don't know what the paper's trying to do. One thing I would say is that in thinking about how specific your thesis needs to be, is that the thesis sets out what the paper is going to do. It gives you a plan. It gives you an idea. So that the body of the paper is not where you're introducing new things that were in the thesis. It's where you're using evidence and argumentation to prove the idea that is in the thesis itself. So I wouldn't worry that you're doing too much in a thesis or you're being too specific in a thesis. That's actually good because it sets up what you're trying to do in the paper. When you get into problems is when the thesis is so vague, is when you don't know what you're going to do in the rest of the paper. A third thing, and I think probably the more confusing things about a good thesis statement, is that it answers the so what question. In other words, the thesis needs to sort of make clear what the stakes of the paper are. It's related to having a good argument or claim, but it's also related to kind of evidence or ideas that are in the paper. In other words, have you moved beyond just good observation and gone into an argument, or have you clarified in the thesis statement what it is the reader needs to see or hear, right? And again, I think that's related to having a good claim or argument, but let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about. All right, so as I went through the week thesis revision activities, one of the revised thesis really caught my idea because I think it does some things well, but also there's some problems with it. Right? This was an attempt at a revised thesis. In a lot of ways, it's really good. Once again, it's a lot more specific than the initial bad thesis was. It was something like George Orwell killed an elephant, and he didn't want to kill the elephant. But this is the revised thesis. George Orwell was pressured into killing the elephant by the crowd of natives around him. Eager to pick apart the corpse, he felt deep regret for the killing and felt a connection to the elephant as a soldier alone away from home. So the good thing about it, it's more specific. What is a problem is it doesn't really answer the so what question because it gets too bogged down in summarizing what happens. In other words, George Orwell is pressured. We know that if we read the story, the crowd of the natives were eager to pick apart the corpse. That's also clear and obvious from the content of the story. So even though this is specific, it's not really dealing with the so what question. Where I think this thesis gets more interesting is this kind of implication here. It's something the reader may not know or may not already have assumed just from reading the essay. And this is a new idea. You felt a connection to the elephant. In other words, the idea here is that when Orwell is describing the elephant, he's making some kind of connection between himself and what he's feeling and what the elephant's feeling. That is not obviously stated, but I think it's something you can make an argument for, so it's a really interesting observation. But a thesis, when I say it needs to answer the so what question, it's taking this observation and trying to say, okay, why is this connection important? It's a really good observation, but what does this connection show me about the essay? What can I use it for to argue a point for that will teach the reader something new? So I did a little further revision and I came up with this thesis. In Shooting an Elephant, George Orwell tries to establish his connection to the elephant as a way of expressing his negative view of the system of empire. Like the elephant in his essay, the empire is a large and destructive, but possesses little actual power or intelligence. So this is an argument here, whereas this is still just an observation. And that's what I mean by answering so what. You've stepped beyond just making interesting observations about the piece to arguing what it's trying to do or what it's trying to say. You made an interpretation. The interpretation here is that the elephant is really like a symbol for how George Orwell feels about the British Empire, that it's large, that it's clumsy, and in fact, in the essay, he's using the elephant as a way of conveying to you his subtle message about what empire is and what it looks like. What's good about this is that this gives the paper something to do. In other words, you're going to have to argue several things. That one, that Orwell feels a connection to the elephant. That's not obvious, and it needs some argumentation and some exploration. That also, too, you'd have to argue that he's using the elephant then to express the system, his negative feelings toward the system of empire, and you'd have to show how, like empire, the elephant doesn't really have much power or intelligence, in contrast to the other factors that George Will describes. So that while this thesis here has a goal or an intention in what it's going to try and do in the course of the paper, if you were trying to write a paper based on this thesis here, you'd end up probably for the most part just retelling the essay, summarizing it. And that's not what you want to do. So when you're thinking about your narrative, what you want to do is to create a thesis statement that makes an argument that your story is going to try and illustrate. In other words, you need to have a point to prove after your thesis statement. Okay, so that's what I mean by answering the so what question. And again, I think it's really related to having a good, strong claim.